Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about logic. You can think of logic as something like the art of thinking well. So what is this art? Let us begin. So it's easier to begin with examples. So here are valid versus sound arguments. I'll define those after I give you the examples. And that's a photograph of Socrates. And they'll be relevant shortly. So here's a valid argument. Claim number one, all men are mortal. Claim number two, Socrates is a man. If you think about those two claims, something happens, something that you just have to be a rational agent to notice. We say in logic, a conclusion logically follows. If you accept one and two, if you think that one and two are true, there's something else that must be the case. There's something else that is impossible for it not to be the case if one and two are true. And I'm sure you can all think of it. That other thing is Socrates is mortal. So a valid argument is like this one, is one that connects claims in a particular way. Some claims are put forth, and those claims entail or ensure or make it necessary that something else is the case. And if you're a rational agent, if you comprehend what the words mean, you can just see it, right? You see valid arguments. Three necessarily follows from one and two. If one and two are true, three has to be true. Here's another example. One, all men are fat. Two, Socrates is a man. Notice something else necessarily follows from this. Socrates is fat, therefore Socrates is fat. It's necessary. If one and two are true, three has to be true. So it's also an instance of a valid argument. Here's an observation. Socrates was fat. So it's a valid argument and the conclusion is true. And yet you should be kind of uneasy about this argument. There's something not right. There's something that doesn't square. That if someone were to reason this way, you would have reason to object to the way they reason. They're not thinking well. And why is that? Why is it that they're not thinking well? Three does logically follow from one and two, and the conclusion is true. So what is it that went wrong? The answer is one of the premises, one of the claims, claim number one, is false. One of the things that they're reasoning from is false. So first observation, these kinds of arguments, the ones you can just see that they have to work, the ones that you see the validity, they are such that some of the claims can be false, and they're still valid. The claims still go through. We'll come back to that shortly. In contrast to valid arguments are sound arguments. And here's an example of a sound argument. Premise number one, claim number one, all men are mortal. Claim number two, Socrates is a man. Something follows from that. In fact, that should feel very familiar, right? You've seen this before. What follows from that? Socrates is mortal. So here's the main observation. The examples of valid arguments, not all of them, some examples, are the same examples of sound arguments. Validity you see. Validity, if you're a rational agent and you think about what the claims say, you can tell whether or not it follows. You can tell whether or not the thing that is followed by the therefore must be the case given the things that came before it. Sound arguments, they're different. They are not something you can just see. A sound argument is a valid argument, but all of the premises are true. So as opposed to the argument in the bottom that has Socrates being fat, that's not sound because it's not an example of sound argument. So let's actually look at definitions. So logic is much like math. And here are some definitions that will help us make sense of what we're doing when we're talking about logic. And just kind of memorize those definitions, just use them this way when you talk to other people in this class. Use the words in this way so we can talk to each other. Sometimes we use the word argument to mean people are shouting at each other, they're fighting. And that's a perfectly good use of the word argument. That is not what philosophers and logicians mean when they use the word argument. That's not what I meant when earlier I said these are arguments. What I mean, what logicians mean, what philosophers mean is something like this. Arguments are sets or collections of premises that are intended to support a conclusion. And premises and conclusion are also technical words. So here's a definition of a premise. A premise is a truth or valuable statement. Let me stop there. A truth or valuable statement is a statement that can be true or false, that is capable of being evaluated on the basis of truth or falsity. So you might have learned to call those things declarative sentences. So if I say something like, my car is blue, it is raining outside, I'm 6'2", I was born in Mexico. All of those are truth or valuable. What does that mean? They can be true or false. I can be telling you the truth, I can be lying to you, I can be deceived. But they are the kinds of things that can be true or false. Other things I can say, like, please shut the door, those are not truth or valuable. Those are articulations of commands or imperatives. I'm trying to get you to do something, but it is incorrect to say that my sentence, please shut the door, is true or false. It's not the kind of thing that can be true or false. Premises are the kind of thing that can be true or false. They're like the other claims I made. So a premise is a truth or valuable statement that is presented as a reason or evidence for the intended conclusion. That's what makes a truth or valuable statement a premise. Now, conclusion. A conclusion is also a truth or valuable statement that is presented as something to be believed or accepted as true. When someone engages in the practice of arguing or puts forth an argument, the point of doing so is to put forth a conclusion that is intended to be believed as true. The point of arguing is to establish a conclusion, to establish that a conclusion is true. And perhaps to be overly redundant in the definitions, let's define truth. So a statement is true if it expresses a fact. If I say my car is blue, that's my statement. And I don't have a car, or my car is red, then there will be no fact that corresponds to my statement. So my sentence, my statement would not be true, it would be false. If there is a fact that corresponds by my statement, that is expressed by my statement, there is a car that is blue that I have, then my statement is true, right? It's very straightforward meaning of the word true. So false if it is not. Example, the earth is, I claim the earth is round, is true if and only if the earth is round. And notice that the second part is not a statement, but a fact. It's an expression of a fact. Here are some more of the vocabulary. So arguments are valid or invalid, sound or unsound. So validity, soundness, they're characteristics or properties of arguments, not premises, not claims, not conclusions. In logic, when we say something is valid, we mean an argument is valid. Or sound, an argument is sound, not premises, they're true or false. So premises are true or false, and arguments are neither. So don't say an argument is true, that's not well defined. There's no definition for truth having to do with arguments. There's definition of truth having to do with statements, things that correspond to the world or not. Arguments are not quite trying to describe the world. They're arranging statements or claims in a particular way for the sake of convincing someone of something. So arguments are not true or false. They can be valid or invalid, sound or unsound. So let's define those notions a bit more carefully. So validity versus soundness, they are, again, properties or characteristics of arguments. And here's a careful definition. A valid argument is one in which the conclusion logically follows from its premises. Notice that I kind of said that already when I give you the first examples. What does that mean? Well, here are a couple of more linguistics kind of cues so you can get a sense of what it means for something to logically follow. It is impossible for the conclusion to be true if the premises are true. Put differently, if the premises of a valid argument are true, the conclusion must be true. Notice that when I gave you the examples, I was saying exactly those things. I was trying to get you to see something of the logical validity of the argument precisely by using those expressions. And at the moment, I take it you were saying, oh yeah, I see it, right? You were understanding the meaning of those expressions and were applying them to the argument in question about Socrates and seeing that it was valid. Validity, you can see if you reason appropriately. So a different way of saying the same thing is the following. Valid arguments do not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. They merely guarantee that truth is preserved. If true premises are given, the conclusion must be true. So it could be that a valid argument has a false conclusion. It can have a true conclusion, a false conclusion. What makes it valid is not the truth or falsity of the conclusion. What makes it valid is that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Or as I said in this last bullet point, that the truth is preserved when it goes from the premises to the conclusion. True premises in, true conclusion out. So it has kind of functional definition. That's the more complicated definition of validity of arguments. Soundness is relatively straightforward. I already gave it to you when I was giving the example. So a sound argument is an argument that is valid. It has everything that I said about validity. And furthermore, the premises are true. So the example I gave you, the one in the bottom about being fat, was valid but not sound. Why? Because one of the premises was false. The first premise, not all men are fat. Some men are not fat. And I give you a famous drawing of a pipe with the inscription, "This is not a pipe," to illustrate some reasoning. I don't know the story behind that painting, it's just cool. Okay, so you might think, okay, fair enough. This feels too mathy. This feels too like definitional thing, but why should I care? Like, what does this matter? When you talk about Socrates being fat or being mortal, you might not think it matters that much. You might think, well, we already knew those things, or you can know those independently. But one of the great beauties of logic is that you can begin from things you know and imply things that you did not know, that were surprising. You can begin with the familiar and look at the logical consequences that are shocking or striking or valuable. And if the argument is valid, then you would know the conclusion of the thing that you have logically implied. And sometimes those things are very important. Like, for example, here's a famous argument, the Kalam cosmological argument. And here's what the argument says. So premise number one, everything that has a beginning has a cause. That seems to be a fundamental principle of reality. Things that come into being by being brought about by other things that exist, that are in being. There seems to be a deep truth there. Premise number two, the universe itself had a beginning, the Big Bang Theory, right? We now know that the universe is not eternal. It began to exist not too long ago. Well, a little bit. If we stop there, you can do exactly the same thing you did when you look at the argument I gave you about Socrates and being mortal. Something logically follows. Notice that we can come to know one and we can come to know two. And when we put them together, something must be the case if those two are the case. And you can see it, right? Here it is. Therefore, the universe had a cause. And that seems pretty shocking. That seems pretty grand. The universe, as we understand it, has space-time intertwined within it. So things that are located within space and time, matter, energy, and so on, they seem to themselves have a cause, something that is not it, something that is not spatial, temporal, and so on. So this conclusion is great, it's grand, it's a big claim. A lot of people think that the conclusion gives you God. So arguments can be used and have been used for proving grand things, great things. And they begin from claims that, premises for which we think we have evidence and reason which are justifiable. And if you put them in the right way, you might be able to notice that from those claims, something much grander follows. In this case, the God exists. So let us not assess the credibility of this argument now, but point out that there's a lot of power to logic. So given this argument matters, right? You might be very thrilled about the conclusion if you're a theist. You might be very bothered by the conclusion if you're an atheist. How does a reasonable, rational person respond to arguments like these? Well, here are the rules for the game, rules for the philosophy game. And that's my title. If you Google what are the rules for the philosophy game, I have no idea what's going to show up, but I made them up. And to say that I made them up is not to say that they're peculiar to me. If you run these rules by any logician, by any philosopher, they'll say, oh yeah, that's fine. It's just I put them together. But anyway, rule number one, it is irrational to accept the premises of a valid argument and not the conclusion. In other words, if you go back at the argument, let me do that, and you look at premise one and say, yeah, it has to be true. How can that not be true? In fact, you might have reasons for it. And look at premise two and say, yeah, that has to be true. And then you notice something follows, the universe has a cause, and that smells like God. it would be irrational for you, for anyone, to deny 3 while at the same time recognizing that it logically follows from 1 and 2 and think that 1 and 2 are true. It is an irrational. You have given up rationality and reason when you do that, when you deny 3 but accept that it logically follows from things that you accept. That's just irrational. You have given up on the game of pursuing truth. So rule number 1, it is rational to do that. Put differently, don't do that, right? Play by the rules of attaining truth, and that's not attaining truth. So a different rule is attack the premises, not the conclusion. In other words, if the conclusion is there's a God, and you think, oh, that cannot be true, the reasonable way of engaging with that argument is by looking at the premises and try to find defects or limitations on the premises, not the conclusion. The beauty of valid arguments is that the credibility or believability of the conclusion depends upon the premises. It is the only rational course of action once you see an argument being valid and you want to deny the conclusion. The only rational course of action is to go after the premises, to try to show that the premises are false. The conclusion you must accept on the basis of the premises or reject on the basis of the premises. It's all about the premises. Now, how do you go about attacking the premises if you think the conclusion is false? You must provide reasons for the premises. Reasons for accepting them if you like the argument, or reasons for rejecting them if you don't like the argument, if you think the argument is false. So it is reason that is the guide for truth. It is reason, the evidence that leads a good philosopher to accept a premise and then to follow reason where it goes, the conclusion of the argument or those premises. Importantly, let me make this explicit. That a premise leads to a conclusion is not a good reason for rejecting it. And it's also not a good reason for endorsing it. That is to do what the sophists do, the intellectually vicious person who does not care about truth, they care about mere persuasion. Remember, the intellectually vicious sophist has already a conclusion in mind. They don't want to look at reality, they don't want to look at the evidence. They just want to argue for whatever it is they antecedently believe. They want to vindicate their stereotypes and their prejudices. They don't want to look at reality or the truth. The philosopher does not do that. And here we have a very clear way of doing that, of being the philosopher. You begin with the premises and you follow them where they go. It is the premises that articulate the evidence, and the way of dealing with an argument is by looking at the premises and seeing whether or not they're true or they're false. If you have a belief on the subject matter already, you suspend the belief and look at the evidence and see whether the evidence supports or undermines your antecedent belief. So let me look at that argument again. A philosopher does not do the following, does not look at the conclusion first and says, oh, nice, it is what I believed all along, or says, oh, too bad, I don't like that conclusion, and then reasons backwards, right? So a way of not being a philosopher or being a sophist is by looking at the conclusion, liking it, and thinking, oh, that confirms my antecedent beliefs, that confirms my preconceptions. Therefore, I will accept 1 and 2 because it gets me what I want, namely 3. Or the reverse, right? You can think, oh, I don't like 3, that I'm an atheist and that there's no God. So I'm going to, because I think there's no God, I'm going to go about denying 1 or 2. I'm going to deny the premises because I don't like the conclusion. Both of those ways of reasoning are sophist. The philosopher looks at the evidence and then follows the evidence where it leads. Not the reverse. If you begin with a conclusion, that's the sophist way of doing it. If you begin with the premises, those are the philosopher's way of doing it. So I'll end here. If you keep going through the PowerPoint, there's I gave you a few fallacious reasonings, a few ways in which people tend to reason. That is poor reasoning. I won't go through it here, but when you have time, please look at it. Okay, see you next time. Bye.